All right, so we are looking at the nervous system today. And, well, just like any of the other physiological systems we have looked at, right, we're going to start with, of course, the functions of that system. And today, with one of our systems, we're actually going to be able to do a drawn visual representation of this system. And I like to do, for this particular system, like a flow chart, which, we'll slowly, progressively fill that out as we make our way through this lecture. So we're looking at the nervous system today. And, well, I guess the first slide up is actually not necessarily the functions of the system, but a couple surrounding factors. I guess my slides just kind of line up with what's information is presented in the book. But we're talking about a concept called homeostasis. Homeostasis is a concept in medicine of essentially, loosely translated to as simple as balance, where the body is essentially, maintaining the status quo, maintaining the equilibrium of the body. And that the homeostasis is largely and most responsibly maintained by the nervous system, because the nervous system essentially regulates everything in our body, as well as with the accompaniment of the endocrine system, which we'll be doing on Thursday. Between these two systems, the neuroendocrine system, as we call it, these systems maintain the homeostasis of the body, which is to essentially keep the body in a check and balance situation. So let's just go straight to the important functions of the system, which is, what exactly is the nervous system responsible for? Now, obviously, we know that the nervous system is pretty complex, right? It's the, housing of our emotions, cognitive, contemplative thoughts and all this stuff. But for massage therapists, more specifically, we're going to take a look at the functions. And we essentially equate it to a basic relay system. So it all starts and revolves around what we call a sensory input. So a sensory input is the nervous system detecting something either from the external world or from our internal environment. So something outside of our body or something within our body. We're going to detect this stimulation, and then we're going to, well, send it towards the central nervous system, at which point we're going to interpret this signal. So let's say that you walk outside and it's 20 degrees outside. For Floridians, that's freezing. I mean, it literally is freezing, but it's also like deadly freezing for us. We're going to run and hide. But your body will detect with thermoreceptors the temperature of the air, sends a signal to our nervous system to then interpret this information. And then, of course, we have to cause the reaction. So then we're going to produce a motor output, or essentially do something in regards to that stimulus. So motor output in regards to the temperature outside could be shivering, rubbing your hands together, something like that, right? In an effort to, generate heat and essentially move away from that negative feedback. Now, like we said, our nervous system does and is responsible for the higher cognitive functions, right? Processing emotions, thoughts, memory recollection, memory processing, memory, saving, all of these extravagant things, right? Our nervous system is pretty amazing. It's pretty crazy, but we're not going to be looking at that, right? As massage therapists, we're essentially looking at that basic relay system, which, and then we can go back to this other slide here, which asked, how does the nervous system transmit signals? Well, we're going to take a deeper look at this throughout, the rest of these slides, but our nervous system essentially uses two methods of communication throughout the entire body, which is electrical stimuli or electrical impulses, and then neurotransmitters, which are the chemical messengers that are produced by the nervous system to cause change. So we'll take a look at both of those concepts here in a second. But our first real crack into the system after the functions is essentially breaking down the nervous system into its parts. And this is where we're going to start working on our little flow chart. So first we're proposed with the idea of what structures do we find in the central nervous system, acronymed the CNS. Well, if you could imagine, the central nervous system is, well, the center of the nervous system. So if you would imagine, what exactly would be the central region of our nervous system, it would be your brain, your spinal cord, your brain stem. Those are the main things. So let's go ahead and start filling out our flow chart here. So, and I'll zoom in later on, and I'll even post the picture, at the end of the video or something, or on your canvas. But so right now we have the nervous system, and we're going to break that down. So we're going to make a little flow chart. So out here we're going to do, and I'm going to acronym this because I'm going to have to put a lot of information on this one tiny board. Normally I have a really big one that I could write a lot on, but right now we're limited. So out here we're going to write the central nervous system, CNS. And back like we said on the slide, the central nervous system composes of three main regions. We have the brain, we have the brain stem, I'm just going to acronym, and then we have the spinal cord. So let's go back to the slides, and we'll actually see all of those come out. And also listed on that, there's some additional structures, which again, we can also fill into our chart, maybe, if you want, right? So the central nervous system structures are covered with particular connective tissue linings called meninges. So the meninges actually, cover the spinal cord and the brain stem and the brain. And we'll actually look at the layers of the meningeal layers, as we'll find, as well as within this space, there is the cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid resides in the dorsal cavity of the body, which is essentially the spinal canal, as well as the cranial cavity. And that cerebrospinal fluid, again, we'll take another look at in just a second, essentially nourishes and helps the functioning of the central nervous system and the nervous system structures in the central nervous system there. So if we have a central nervous system, right, why would we differentiate it being central if there wasn't something outside of it? So in this particular case, now we have the peripheral nervous system, which I'll just go ahead. I won't zoom out of the thing yet, but obviously we're going to put that on the other end of our flow chart. So we're going to acronym the peripheral nervous system, the P and S. So peripheral, right? Peripheral means on the outer edges, right? So your peripheral vision, right, is on the edge of your vision. So peripheral nervous system is everything outside of the central nervous system, which includes your spinal nerves and cranial nerves and other various structures, right? So essentially, once the structure leaves the central column, the central canal, then it is now in the peripheral nervous system. So there are nerves that come directly off of your brain, the cranial nerves, and then of course nerves that come directly off the spinal cord, spinal nerves. So it's the peripheral nervous system that's actually going to divide down pretty well. And to me, dividing down the peripheral nervous system, especially when we get to a certain part of this, is going to be extremely important. And to me, the bulk of the lecture, which essentially I'm talking about the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is subdivided into two sections. We have what's called the autonomic nervous system, and we have the somatic nervous system. So again, just going to use acronyms on our flow chart, and I'll zoom in here for a second for you guys. So we have the autonomic well, I'll put it over here. Somatic nervous system, SNS, and then the autonomic nervous system over here, the ANS. So I'll just keep filling in as we go. So let's go ahead and start breaking down those systems, because the peripheral nervous system, in my opinion, is probably going to be the more complicated, because we want to learn more about like how massage affects the autonomic nervous system in particular. The central nervous system side, we're essentially just going to be looking at the structures, and it's just going to be structure memorization, location of structure memorization, essentially. So the somatic nervous system is, well, we largely say governs and regulates skeletal muscle tissue, which is, we say that this system is largely voluntary in the sense that the bulk of this system, the bulk of these nerve endings go to and innervate structures that we will consciously control. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't autonomic, or excuse me, automatic processes within the somatic nervous system, but we largely equate this system with skeletal muscle tissue and certain receptors that, you know, we just have always running, such as the, you know, hearing, vision, smell, stuff like that. So like we said, you know, largely voluntary simply because it governs the skeletal muscle tissue and our conscious control over it. But yeah, couple autonomic, or excuse me, automatic processes, as we like to call it. So on our flow chart, we'll just go ahead and put, you know, skeletal muscle. And why not? Just since it was on the slide, skeletal muscle and senses, we'll say. So now it's the autonomic system that we're really going to break down a lot. So our autonomic nervous system is broken down into two different sections. We have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. So going to write that down here, you know, just for space, I got to make this look best I can. We're going to do the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Now, again, this is going to be, in my opinion, the bulk of the lecture. So let's go ahead and I'll do a quick little zoom in for you guys so you can see. That way you can fill in. So, like we said, we have the peripheral nervous system broken down into the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. Remember, somatic over here, skeletal muscle tissue and the senses, and then the autonomic nervous system into the sympathetic and parasympathetic over here. So, like I said, it's the difference between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division of the nervous system that I personally want you guys to pay more attention to. Of course, you know, you do want to know about the various structures that we're going to find in the system as well. But in regards to the pertinent information, I think it's more important to gather the difference out of there, especially in regards to the effects of massage therapy. And personally, I say that if we're talking about how massage affects the body and the positive and negative benefits massage can have effect-wise on the body, it really revolves around between the, you know, pinging back and forth between these two activations of the system. So let's go back to our slides. Oh, I missed it. I was looking at the slide wrong. So yeah, the autonomic nervous system governs, like, essentially automatic processes, involuntary processes such as reflexes, organ function and control, things like that. And then this slide was what are the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. I'm just kind of getting ahead of myself because I want to get right to the bulk of the lecture here. But yes, the two divisions are the autonomic nervous system and the, excuse me, are the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And this picture right here on this slide is a really good representation of pretty much just the differences between the two, what they're governing and how they function, which we're going to come back to that picture here in a little bit. So the nervous system, just like any system, is made of cells. Now, the nervous system in this particular case has a couple types of cells, one of which, right, we can call a nerve cell. Very straightforward, very simple. So that we call those nerve cells neurons. But we also have supporting cells called glial cells, or often known as neuroglia. Now, those glial cells we'll take a quick look at are very, they're actually mostly connective tissue, and support and help the nervous system. But the neurons are the actual nervous system tissue that will conduct those impulses that we talked about earlier for sending signals. So let's take a quick look at some of the glial cells here. Now, that picture right there is pretty much everything we're going to take a look at in essential regards for the glial cells, but there's a couple we're going to pay attention to, such as the oligodendrocytes and the Schwann cells. But we do have the epidermal cells, which the epidermal cells are responsible for helping to produce the cerebrospinal fluid in that central nervous system region. The astrocytes, I think, is on the next slide. So we'll wait on that. The microglial cells are essentially like, if you remember back to the organelles of chapter 18, the microglial cells are like the lysosomes. They're kind of like the little janitors. They help to clean out the cerebrospinal fluid and around the nervous system structures. Satellite cells are the cells that will help to relay signals between different parts of nerve endings and neurons. And then the other cells, the astrocytes and the oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells, we're going to have a dedicated slide for. So, just knock out some of the basic glial cells right there for you. But our next slide is, well, what is the largest and most numerous glial cells, and what are they shaped like? Well, they're astrocytes, and they're shaped like stars. And the astrocytes help with essentially just relating like nutrients, and they largely are responsible for forming what's called the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is this blood vessel barrier that is very super selective about what can actually cross through and enter the brain, right? So if you think like your brain is like the White House, Pentagon, like the most highest top security thing of your body, you only let certain things in and out of that area. So the blood-brain barrier is what is responsible for that. Now, if you actually look at medication classes, there's, some medications aren't even able to pass through the blood-brain barrier, and so others are. And technically, those medications would actually affect, your nervous system, your brain. Okay, so there was a slide for this. Which glial cell is responsible for producing cerebrospinal fluid? It's the epidermal cell. The job of the microglia is, right, like we said, the janitor. It cleans up the central nervous system, so we can just blast through these since I already mentioned it. Now it's the oligodendrocytes. So oligodendrocytes, where are they found? The oligodendrocytes are found in the central nervous system. Now, these oligodendrocytes are found in the central nervous system that are responsible for creating a fatty coating on the nerve cells called, well, we'll look at that, but myelin in another slide. And this fatty coating helps to essentially insulate and increase the conduction rate of the nerve. So these oligodendrocytes create the fatty myelin sheath, as we're going to look at, which is in this slide here. What is the myelin sheath? What does this myelin sheath produce or do? And then what glial cells produce the myelin sheath? So like we were saying, this myelin sheath is this fatty layer that goes along and envelopes these nerves, these neurons, and helps the conduction rate, right? So it's like, think like, if I had a live wire, well, how could I make the signal transmit faster, right? I would put some kind of grease or something, some conductivity substance on it. Well, that is the conductivity thing. So the oligodendrocytes create the myelin sheath in the central nervous system, while it's the Schwann cells that create the myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system. So that is the difference. And we can actually put that on our little chart here. So we right next to the central nervous system here, we can write oligo, and then peripheral nervous system, we can write Schwann. That way we'll know the difference between which glial cells are producing that. Now let's take a look at some additional structures that are going to help with nerve conduction, called the nodes of Ranvier. Now, the nodes of Ranvier are the gaps that exist in between the myelin sheaths. So you can see in this particular picture, right, we have the fatty myelin substance, and you can actually, if you actually look at, you pay a little close attention, we zoom in here. Oop, nope. There we go, zoom in a little bit. You can actually, so this is the myelin, right? This is actually the Schwann cell, that little, looks like a little nucleus thing right there. That's actually the Schwann cell. And then the node of Ranvier is this gap. So sometimes we call them myelin sheath gaps. And essentially what's happening is when the impulse travels, it goes zoop, 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 zoop. It just like zoops through from node to node by passing through the fatty substance. So it just helps to increase the conductivity rate of the neuron, right? Because speed is of the essence in regards to the nervous system. We want signals to go very fast. Now, in regards to this myelination, we do have, so essentially, not all nerves have myelination. So we have two types of what we call brain matter. We have white and gray matter, white matter versus gray matter. And why they call it white versus gray is just based off of the imaging resonance that they would do and the way that it would come up on those images. But the myelination causes the parts of the brain or the nerves that are myelinated to glow white and bright on these imagings. And then unmyelinated nerves are darker gray. So that's where we have white versus gray matter. So you know, some parts of the nervous system, some parts of the brain don't have myelination while the others do. And we'll see why exactly here in a second, that some parts of the brain we wouldn't necessarily want or need that nerve conduction to be super fast. So speaking of nerves still, the impulse conducting nervous system structure is, well, the neuron. The neuron, the basic neuron, is the functional unit of the system. So we've talked about functional units in other lectures, right? Skeletal system was the osteon, muscular system was the sarcomere. So functional units of the system, the basic, most foundational building block of the system, right, is a relatively fun fact, important thing to note. So make sure that you put that in your notes there. So let's break down a neuron. Now, this particular neuron we're going to be looking at is actually what we call a multipolar neuron, which is probably the most numerous that you would find in the body, just because they're all over the peripheral nervous system. But you know, this also gives us a good example of what structures we find. So the part of the neuron that contains the nucleus and organelles is the cell body, or the soma, which is this big fat blue blob of this neuron. Now, there are some things attached to this this particular multipolar neuron, such as dendrites, as well as an axon. And we're going to break those down in just a second. So the dendrites are the part of the neuron that are responsible for bringing stimulation or stimuli into the cell body or the soma for processing. So the dendrites essentially reach out and they're interacting or touching other various things with specialized receptors to detect certain things, pain, thermoreceptors, heat, all that stuff, right? And then they bring that information into the cell body, which then gets sent into, or excuse me, sent out from the cell body via the axon. So the axon is the big, long tail-like extension that extends from the cell body that then transmits the signal to the target destination. Now, the axon can be very, very, very long, and essentially is going to run the length of the nerve to where it terminates. And so some axons can be extremely long, such as like in the sciatic nerve. They run almost the entire length of the leg. So the axon carries the signal away from the cell body, or as I like to equate, axon away, right? It's going to send the signal away from it. Now, like we said, this was a multipolar neuron. There are different other classifications of neurons based off of their structure. So if you could imagine, if we have a multipolar neuron, then we probably have a unipolar, bipolar, and then, well, the multipolar. So the unipolar, right, obviously just how it sounds, just has one extension, right, to detect signals, right, and typically involved with sensory input. Bipolar neurons, obviously, two different types of extensions. And these bipolar neurons are usually found within the central nervous system, sometimes in the retinas of the eye. Well, not just sometimes, but whatever. But they serve more of a interpretive function. So it'll make more sense when we actually look at the relay arc or reflex arc in a second. But this nerve is actually going to sit between two nerves to then relay signals. It's like the exchanger of information. And then the multipolar neuron, which we just kind of looked at, is essentially, sending out signals to and from and this, that, and the other. So let's take a look at that reflex arc that we're just talking to. So we have to bring information from the outside towards the center. So like we said in the beginning, either from the external world or our internal environment. So like we said, either we feel the cold air, or let's say that, I don't know, something in your body. Let's say like you got a kidney stone, right? I mean, it's an extreme example, but right, you got a kidney stone and all of a sudden you just have excruciating pain in your low back, right? That's a sensation that we're going to pick up via a particular nerve. So these nerves that are taking information from the external or internal world and bringing it to the central nervous system are called afferent neurons, or also known as sensory neurons. So afferent brings information to the central nervous system. So let's go ahead and we can actually put this on our flow chart. So we're going to say afferent over here with the central nervous system and put an arrow pointing to it. And then we'll do that for the neurons that are going to take it away. So afferent, also synonymously known as sensory neurons, are sensing information out, in wherever, and bringing that information into the central nervous system to essentially process and then cause a reaction. So let's go back to our slides. Now, what neurons are going to carry the impulses away from the central nervous system? So we brought we brought this letter, right? Think like a post office, brought this letter to the central hub. Okay, cool. Where is it going? What are we doing? Well, now we need to send information out along what's called an efferent pathway, or what we call along a motor neuron. So we're going to draw another arrow here leading away from the central nervous system, and we'll zoom in on this later, but efferent. So the efferent neuron carries the information away from the central nervous system to then cause change in the body. Now, if you're an English aficionado, an English person that does like the semantics of words, there's a difference between affect versus effect. And if we think about it in context of this situation, the affect is essentially the cause, and then the effect is the result, or well, the effect. So same thing, afferent is the affect, or what we could even say, sometimes I call it the affliction, right? So like if someone poked me with a needle, ow, that hurts, I'm afflicted with pain. Or well, excuse me, my body processes this painful signal, sends it to the nervous system, central nervous system, for processing, and then it's going to send a signal back out to then cause change, which is probably to move my arm away from someone stabbing me and then probably punch them back, right? So it's essentially cause versus effect. Now, on our next slide here, this is the summation, which is the reflex arc. So the reflex arc is, like we said, the whole circuit, the whole relay, right? I touch a hot stove, receptors in my hand say like, oh, this is really hot, it's causing tissue damage. We're sending that signal to the central nervous system. All right, we process that. Yeah, that's definitely hot. We've got tissue damage. We need to do something about this here, Bob. All right, let's go ahead and send signals out through along the chains of muscles and everything in our body to remove our hand off of the stove. That is a reflex arc. So afferent pathway to the central nervous system, interneurons are going to process this information and then send a signal back out through an efferent pathway. That is a reflex arc. So taking a look at nerves and how they're composed, very similar to the muscular system that we looked at, where we had, you know, the muscle fibers with its own little components, and then we took bundles of muscle fibers together and wrapped them up, and then took a bunch of bundles of muscle fibers, right? So if you remember that, this should be pretty simple. So a nerve is a bundle of nerve fibers or neurons, typically in the peripheral nervous system. Now we'll break it down, but we can just take a look at this picture here. So if we zoom in right here, like we said, very similar to the muscle, right? So we have, if you look here, we have the individual neuron, right? So which is, you know, the axon of that neuron with the, you know, myelination, and then we're going to wrap that individual neuron with connective tissue. Remember back to the muscular system where we had the endomysium. Well, neurium, get it? Because endo meant innermost, neurium, right, means connective tissue covering on the nerve. So this is the innermost connective tissue covering of a nerve, and it covers the individual nerve fiber. So like we said, we take a nerve fiber, a neuron, and then we group it up with a bunch of other neurons to make a fossicle. Now this fossicle is just by definition a bundle of nerve fibers grouped together, just like a fossicle for the nerve muscular system. Remember back to the muscular system, we covered that fossicle with the perineurium, which is the covering surrounding a group of muscle fibers, which then we take a bunch of those bundles, as you can see here, to make the nerve in its entirety, which then we cover with, well, it's kind of covered here, but we cover that with the epineurium. Again, all connective tissue. There we go. So like we said, that's the breakdown of a nerve. You know, if we built it from its smallest little structure all the way up to the nerve in of itself, just like I said, very similar to the muscular system. Now, alongside the efferent versus afferent thing here, we have what's called tracts. Tracts are essentially just that, but of the central nervous system. So there are essentially like a network highway of nerves and all these things that run through the central nervous system. And so if you think that, well, the central nervous system is the final essential processing plant of information, well, headquarters is literally here, the brain. Now, it's not to say that every single signal that's ever going to get sent into your central nervous system makes it all the way to the brain. At the spinal level, there are reflex processes that can like basically automatically act, because if you think about it, like with the hot stove thing, it should be almost instantaneous that I take my hand off of a hot stove, right? So if that signal from my hand going, or even let's say I stepped on like a Lego or something, or whatever, right? I want to immediately withdraw my leg. We call that a flexor withdrawal arc. I want to immediately remove it because I want the least amount of damage to occur. So if I have to send that signal from the bottom of my foot all the way to my brain, that signal has to travel a lot further, as if it was cut off at, say like the sacral level of the spine to be processed and then cause change and reaction. Now, the tracks, like, kind of slightly went off topic, but the tracks in the central nervous system just run up towards the brain, afferent tracks, like the afferent pathways, or down from the brain to go out, efferent tracks. So in regards to nerve impulse and conduction, well, like we said, the nerves will send signals, transmit signals. So we have to be electrically charged in order to do so. So there's a few states that a nerve must maintain and rotate through in order to do that. So first, a nerve that is ready to send a signal is considered polarized. Now, when this signal is sent, it depolarizes and it essentially pushes through the rest of this nerve along the path of the nerve in order to, send it along the way. So we call this depolarization. Then, in order for the nerve to send the signal again, it must repolarize. So those are the three states of a nerve as it's sending a signal in regards to nerve impulse and conduction. So being polarized, sending the signal to depolarize, and then repolarizing to send a new signal again. And this is all facilitated with the sodium-potassium pump of the nervous system. The sodium-potassium pump is the pump mechanism responsible for exchanging the sodium and potassium ions, and we're not going to get into the positives and negatives of those, through the cell membranes, and which then causes the changing of the states. Now, I mean, if you looked at the picture hard enough and analyzed it, you can see what it's loosely getting at, how we're taking some ions in and out, and how that's actually causing this electrical signal to change, right, to depolarize and repolarize. But like I said, it's a little bit beyond what we need to know. So in regards to impulse conduction, we have what's called action potential. We did kind of mention this in the muscular system. And the all or none law is what we also mentioned in the muscular system. But action potential is essentially the potential to act, which is that the nerve is polarized, ready to send out electrical signals, right, and essentially do its job. And when we look at the all or none response, right, so this is where we're actually going to see it more as opposed to when we looked at it in the muscular system. So essentially, your nerves will not send a signal if the signal is not strong enough to trip the sensor, basically. For instance, let's say like if I poked you, right, but I poked you ever so slightly and lightly that you didn't even feel it. I'd made contact with your body wherever I poked you, but it didn't register on a nervous system level, right? And so in that case, it didn't send a signal. But however, if I poke you hard enough that it activates and crosses the threshold barrier of stimuli, it's going to send that signal, and it's going to send that signal to its maximum ability without any hesitation. So if you actually just take a brief look at that picture, you can see how like there's the central status quo of the nerve just resting. And that if you try to like flick the wire and say, so you can see the failed initiations, they don't cross the threshold in order to produce the signal sending, right, to cross the threshold of recognition. But if it does cross the threshold, then we're going to depolarize and send the signal, repolarize, and come back to our resting state. So the basic principle of that. And I guess we can try to apply that to massage therapy, right? So like, some people just aren't going to feel anything, right? Some bodies just might be, hyposensitive to massage, right? So certain people like bigger bodies, that's, muscles that are more well developed might need more stimuli, more pressure, such as that, in order to feel a benefit, right? So that's why, we always want to try to find the Goldilocks pressure in regards to our massage. The refractory period, just a fun fact thing, it's the time in which it takes for a nerve to essentially get back to being repolarized. Fun fact. So going back to that white versus gray matter thing, we talked about, how, some nerves, have no myelination and other nerves that do. Well, this is what we call continuous conduction versus saltatory conduction. So, well, as the name should say, continuous conduction means that these nerves are continually sending their signals at all the time. So this is typically like nerves that are constantly registering information, like your eyes, visual stimuli, senses, basically, right? These things are witnessing and recognizing things all the time. So they don't need to be myelinated because that signal is just constantly going. Versus, nerves, the saltatory conduction, which is responsible for just like sending signals when necessary. We want to make sure that signal gets sent as fast as possible. So we send that alongside the myelinated nerve. So in the muscular system, we looked at the neuromuscular junction. Well, this is essentially that. So it's kind of like a recap here. A synapse is the place at which the signal is transmitted from the nervous system into another structure. So, looking at the synapse, there's two types of synapses. We have electrical synapses, and then we have chemical messenger synapses, chemical synapses, which the chemical synapses we looked at were like in the muscular system, where we passed along the acetylcholine in between the telodendrite of the nerve to the cell membrane of the muscle fiber, right? So the electrical signals, mostly between individual neurons, where they're just going to zip, 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 send their electrical impulses, versus the chemical signals, where probably in pretty much everything else in the body, because we use chemical messengers from the nervous system to cause change. But as a brief recap, remember that we have the synaptic bulb of the telodendrite. So synaptic bulb right here, and then a gap in between the bulb and the plasma membrane of the affected structure called the synaptic gap. Then we have, the receptor sites within the cell membrane that are going to receive the neurotransmitters, which then are going to cause change in the structure in itself. So, pretty simple. I know that we just went through that quick, but we've already kind of touched on that. Nothing too crazy to go through there. So speaking of neurotransmitters, here's just a brief list of a few. So we'll just kind of touch on some of the more important ones. So remember, neurotransmitters are the chemical messengers of the nervous system that essentially elicit change throughout the body. Acetylcholine, as we looked at, stimulates the contraction of muscles. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are the adrenaline hormones. They stimulate sympathetic activity, as well as regulate other things in the body. So there's other reasons to have the epinephrine and norepinephrine in the body, outside of just like, oh my God, I'm scared and I'm running away. The dopamine, serotonin, and enkephalins and endorphins, those are our feel-good hormones. Essentially the dopamine's kind of like with concentration, serotonin's with those feel-good, happiness, enkephalins and endorphins, usually like in response to vigorous activity, like the runner's high kind of thing, those get released. Histamines are a response of the nervous system, an inflammatory response of the nervous system that essentially is going to try to create a localized inflammation to essentially, fight off infection, stuff like that. So like, when you get bit by a mosquito or something, you get the little itchiness and the bubble there. Well, that's actually a histamic response. It's like an allergic response to, fight off whatever is there. Gamma aminobutyric acid, GABA, is an inhibitory receptor, and actually it's related with relaxation. Now, you can actually do GABA like supplements. However, most GABA supplements don't actually cross the blood-brain barrier, but typically GABA supplements usually help with sleeping aids sometimes. But they do say that some because in our digestive system, we have what's called the enteric nervous system, which they do say there are GABA receptors in there for that to affect. Pretty interesting. I could talk about GABA a little bit more, but I guess I won't. Substance P is the neurotransmitter responsible for painful perception and transmitting of the pain perceptions, painful signals. So just a brief overview of those neurotransmitters. So the meninges, as we had talked about earlier, in the meningeal layers, well, what are they? There's 3 layers. We have the outermost layer, which is the dura matter. So the outermost layer wants to be strong. So dura, like durable, is hard, right? The hard outer layer. Then we have the inner layer, or the middle layer, which is the arachnoid layer, which there's several layers of the arachnoid layer, but whatever. And we call it the arachnoid because it's very webbed. It's a type of connective tissue that kind of like binds and sticks stuff like a spider's web. And then our innermost layer is the pia matter, which pia in Greek means soft. So this side is soft, right? Because of our nerves and brain, right? We want to be gentle, so it's soft. Those are the layers of the meningeal layers that we said line the brain and spinal cord. So like we said, the cerebral spinal fluid is produced by the epidermal cells, and that this cerebral spinal fluid essentially just creates acts as a shock absorber, right? Because it's going to help, think like if I put a glass vase in a Amazon box and I didn't put any packing foam in there or whatever, right? It would just shake around and and then I would just have a smashed vase. So it kind of acts in the same regards as that, as well as that's where we're going to have all the nutrients kind of free floating. That's where we're going to release waste out into to then be cleaned. So, very, very useful stuff, right? Here's that blood-brain barrier that we talked about. Like we said, it's an extremely selectively permeable wall of blood vessels that really protect what comes into the brain. So now we're getting into some structures, and this is where we can really start filling out the rest of our flow chart here. So what is the largest, most superior portion of the brain? What is the cerebral cortex? What are the grooves and ridges called that give the cerebrum its characteristic shape? And what separates the brain into 2 halves? Well, first and foremost, the brain is split, the largest region and section of the brain is the cerebrum. So going to fill this in. So we have the cerebrum. The cerebrum has 2 hemispheres. And each hemisphere has 4 lobes. Now those 4 lobes line up with the different plates of the skull. So we have the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobe, each governing their own different parts of things of the brain. And the cerebrum is like we said, what gives it the characteristic shape. We have those grooves and we have the ridges. So we have the gyri and sulci. So the gyri I like to think as the high rise. Those are the ridges, and the sulci are the grooves, right? Like if you're sulking, you're down in the grooves, down in the dumps, kind of thing. And both of these hemispheres are separated by the longitudinal fissure, which is the split of the brain. So yeah, don't try to see you squint in your eyes there. I was gonna enlarge it there. So again, I have to be very small with it, but you get the idea that we're trying to write all that what we just did under the cerebral column here, the cerebrum. So cerebrum is covered by the cerebral cortex, right? Cerebrum. The cerebrum is broken into 2 hemispheres, each hemisphere having 4 lobes, right? Frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and then of course, giving its characteristic appearance, the gyri and the sulci. All right, so let's go ahead and move on. I see you're still looking, but don't worry, we'll take a look at it later, and you can fill in the rest of it. Okay, well, next slide was the different lobes of the brain. So those are the lobes, right? As we just mentioned. Four lobes each side, 8 in total: frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital. Now, also with this brain, there's another structure we look at, which is the hollow center of the brain called the diencephalon. So, continuing on, I guess I'll back out of the share so you can see me write this down. So we're going to draw another thing from the brain. So we're going to do diencephalon. And again, I'm going to abbreviate because I don't have room, but you guys make sure on a very big piece of paper, maybe even get a poster board, you can write it all out. So diencephalon houses several major structures, which includes the thalamus, hypothalamus, pituitary, and pineal. So 4 major glands that are essentially going to govern like your entire body, especially like the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. We're going to take a look at those in the endocrine system lecture. So we're not going to get into these just now and their functions. That'll be for another lecture. But you can, for now, write down that the diencephalon contains all of those structures. And so that's the brain. So another fun fact, again, something we're going to touch on in the endocrine system. How does the pituitary gland connect to the hypothalamus? There's 2 ways. One is we have a slender stalk called the infundibulum, and then we have a neural connection. So via nerves and the slender stalk known as the infundibulum, we have the connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and that is the pituitary gland, not what you might think it looks like, I swear. Again, we're going to take a look at that on Thursday. So the next part of the brain that we're looking at is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is, now I'm just going to write this out to the side, largely is responsible for the coordination of complex muscular movements. So for example, like, those people that you've probably seen with cerebral palsy have, hard time coordinating and moving, right? Shaking, right? Stuff like that. So the cerebellum is responsible for, motor movement, motor coordination. So those were the brain structures, the cerebrum, diencephalon, and the cerebellum. So we'll zoom in on that later in a sec. Now it's time to move into the brainstem. There's 3 different parts of the brainstem, and loosely we just want to take a look at the functions of them. So when it comes to writing out the brainstem on this chart, I like to write them in the top-down order. So I'm just going to zoom out. So we have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So I like to write them out like that because that way I know the order in which they are from top down, right? So midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. So let's take a quick look at loosely what these are responsible for. The midbrain is essentially the middleman, as it might sound. It's literally the midpoint between the brain and then essentially going into the rest of the body. So it's going to receive signals from the brain, it's going to receive signals from the cerebellum, and then it's going to send them wherever, right? The pons and medulla oblongata, honestly, I really just kind of put them both together. And like every time I restudy these sections, it's like they swap the functions, I feel, on them. Oh, sorry, let me try to go back to the slide here. So the pons, as it says on the slide, connects the cerebellum and the cerebrum with the spinal cord. And then as it says on the medulla oblongata, it transmits the sensory and motor impulses between other parts of the brain and spinal cord, considered one of the most vital part of the brain as it plays the role for with respiration and cardiovascular function. But I've also seen newer science talking about the pons probably being more responsible for that than the medulla oblongata. So I don't know, I'll probably have to fix the slide, but kind of I just usually say learn them both together. And usually I think most textbooks and questions I've seen, and sadly the MLEX, probably doesn't keep their information up to date. I think it's safer to say that we would associate these to the medulla oblongata than the pons at this moment, but I'll have to keep my research going there. But that's the basic gist of the brain stem, which is the stalk that comes from the brain down to the spinal cord. So before we get to the spinal cord, we have to actually exit the cranial cavity. And how do we do so? Well, there's a big hole in your head for us to do that, because obviously we have the cranial cavity, right? Our brain being in there is this encased thing of bone, but there's a big hole at the bottom of your occipital bone called the foramen magnum. This big hole in the bottom of the head that the spinal cord descends from the brain to go through the passageway called the spinal canal, the vertebral canal, which is the central region of the vertebrae. And so, okay, now the spinal cord is inside the spinal canal. Well, how do we get out of the spine, right? Well, we have to go out of it through, as you see in this picture here, what's called the intervertebral foramen, which means, so first off, foramen means hole. So as I like to think, foramen, for a man, you're going to dig a hole, Tony. Dig a hole for a man. Foramen. So dig a hole for a man. Foramen means hole. So magnum foramen means big hole, in this case in your head. So everybody's got a big hole in their head. And then intervertebral foramen is, a hole in between two vertebrae where the spine comes out of. And if you think about it, my weird fun fact is, your skeleton, especially when you look at the spine and the cranial cavity, it's like a suit of armor for your nervous system. It's like if you really think about it, you're just a blob of nerves. Crazy. But anyways, that is the makeup of how your spinal cord travels through the suit of armor that it's wearing. A couple extra fun facts. What is the caudua equina? The caudua equina, first off, caudal means tail end. Equina means horse. So this literally means the horse's tail. And essentially roughly around the level of like L2, the L2 vertebrae in your lumbar region, your spinal cord starts to branch out like a horse's tail, like a big bushy tail. So let's take a look at these peripheral system nerves. And starting with the cranial nerves, we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Now, I will briefly touch on all of them, but there's 5 in which we actually want to pay more attention to. Why the first 3, I don't know. I just keep always hearing time and time again. That's, just like the biggest amount of questions my students have ever seen on the MBLEX and stuff. But then the others that I particularly pay attention to remember, have relevance to either a pathological condition or something we can really consider for massage. So first and foremost, there's usually a mnemonic associated with remembering the order of the nerves. And so a mnemonic is where you take the first letter of each word and then associate a word with that, right? Now, the traditional one is like on old Olympus, some blah, blah, blah. I don't know. It's just makes no sense to us in the modern age nowadays. It was made like in the 1800s or something. I don't know. And people were vaulting over mountains or some weirdness. But in the modern age, you know, some of us might have read the Harry Potter books or seen the movies. So this Harry Potter mnemonic, I think, really helps, but I can list another one for those who don't know about Harry Potter. And if you don't know about Harry Potter, shame on you. So on they traveled and found Voldemort guarding very ancient Horcruxes. So again, each letter of what I just said represents the letter representation of one of the cranial nerves. Now, for those who've never seen Harry Potter, only once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are had. So once you take it, you have a good vacation, I guess. I don't know if that's that helps you out. But let's take a look at what these all break down into. So our first cranial nerve is olfactory. So olfactory means the sense of smell. And it is so basically each of these nerves kind of either goes for its length or whatever in this particular order, but also like where they're found. But the olfactory nerve is the shortest cranial nerve. It literally runs from like right here to your brain, very short. And it's very interesting because maybe that's why smell is so intimately related to our memory, right? One of our greatest sensory perceptions is smell, and how it can just really travel you back, right? You smell some fresh baked cookies and it takes you back to grandma's house when you're like 2 years old, 3, 4, 5 years old, whatever, right? So olfaction is smell, and it's the first cranial nerve. Then we have optic, right, which is visual stimulation. So registering light hitting our retinas of the eyes. Then we have oculomotor. Oculomotor is then going to move the eyes. So I typically like to give an example of like if you walked into an ancient tomb. Well, the first thing you're going to notice when you walk into an ancient tomb is that the dank, musty smell in the air. Then you're going to notice that there's no light. And then you're going to move your eyes around and look for a light source. So our fourth cranial nerve is the trochlear nerve, which is involved with eye movement as well, alongside the oculomotor. And then we have the trigeminal nerve. Now this is one of the more important ones I said to remember. So the first three, the olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trigeminal. The trigeminal nerve, there's three main branches, and they essentially attach and send and receive signals from the bulk of the face here. But there's a condition called trigeminal neuralgia that is like intense pain in the face caused by this nerve, and that's why I want you to remember that one. Abducens helps move the eyeballs. Facial nerve controls muscles of the face. Vestibulocochlear regulates the vestibular system in our inner ear, the inner ear fluid. So it regulates our hearing, it regulates our equilibrium and coordination and balance. Then we have the glossopharyngeal, right? Taste buds and the tongue. The vagus nerve, we'll just come back to this. I'm gonna knock them all out. But the vagus nerve is also my top one to remember. Why? As you see, it just says regulates organs, but we'll touch on that in a second. Then we have the accessory and hypoglossal nerves, which help to move the tongue as well. The vagus nerve, though. Vagus nerve, really cool and interesting cranial nerve. One, it is the longest cranial nerve in the body. It literally runs from your brain all the way to your stomach, and essentially, speaks to, communicates, and relays information to and from major organs such as your heart and your stomach. So, the vagus nerve is responsible for what we call vasovagal syncope, which is fainting due to sudden drops of blood pressure because of if you see the sight of blood, vagus nerve gets overstimulated and can cause sudden drop of blood pressure to make you faint, pass out. But the vagus nerve is also intimately related with the parasympathetic response. And so let me zoom in here on my face. The vagus nerve, runs from your brain, and comes like behind the ear, actually innervates the, behind the ear area all the way down to the, like I said, the stomach. So we can actually stimulate the vagus nerve with massage touch and strokes to help generate parasympathetic response, right? It's that, remember that goose raba thing where you rub the earlobes, where you're also rubbing, when you rub the earlobes, you're rubbing like behind that ear too, which stimulates the vagus nerve to create a calming, relaxing response. So vagus nerve, very cool nerve, in my opinion. Make sure, so like I said, out of all these, as I go back to the slide, out of all these, where's my thing? Oh, there it is. As I go back to the slide here, remember that the first three, the olfactory, optic, oculomotor, especially remember that olfactory means smell, trigeminal because we have a pathology for it, and then the vagus nerve because it's just so cool. Then when it comes to the spinal cord, how many pairs of spinal nerves are there as they exit the vertebral column? 31 pairs of spinal nerves. I think it was 33. I might have to double check, but 31 pairs. So on the spinal cord, we're just going to say 31 pairs. Now, in regards to these segments of the spinal nerves, well, information has to come into the spinal cord, and then exit the spinal cord. So information has to come in one direction, information has to go out in another. I like to give this an example as a restaurant. So a restaurant takes in food orders, right? Or let's say like their supply truck of food comes in and they deliver that food to the back door, to the back of house. So that means that information or food in this example comes to the back of the building. Then they cook the food, serve it to the customers, and the customers get a doggy bag of food to take with them out the front door. So information or food comes into the back and then exits out the front. So in this particular case, now we're just going to use anatomical terms. Well, dorsal means back, so dorsal root means that that's the back of the nerve. And then ventral root means, or ventral means front, so ventral root means out the front. Now, also on the slide, a ganglion is a large cluster of nerves that, we do have lots of ganglia along the central nervous system, just outside of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, right in front of the spinal cord, spinal column. There's large clusters of nerves. So then we're going to look at these major plexes. So three major plexus that we're looking at, which includes the cervical plexus, which is the upper neck here. Then we have the brachial. So the cervical plexus, helps to innervate muscles of the head, neck, and shoulders. The brachial plexus then goes down into the arm, brachial meaning arm, and it supplies muscles of the upper extremity. And then the lumbosacral innervates muscles of the abdomen, lower back, and down into the leg and the extremities. So if we actually take a look at this picture, we can see the different divisions here. So cervical plexus up here, brachial plexus, lumbosacral, major plexus of nerves. And a plexus just means a group of intersecting nerves. Oop, I'm going wrong. Okay, there we go. I'm going the wrong way. So when it comes to nerves, spinal nerves, we have what's called dermatomes and myotomes. So if you actually, let's take a look at that picture again. So you see how like the nerves coming from the spinal cord go out almost like directly laterally in a line. Well, if we actually look at this dermatome map, a dermatome map means that this is the area of skin that a nerve supplies signals or sensory information to and from. So if you actually look and we zoom in on this guy, you can see that this is labeled for each individual nerve, right? So cranial, cervical nerve 3, right? Root nerve, pair of nerves 3 innervates this area, 4 this area, 5, right? So this just means that this is a particular area of skin and the body that this nerve touches, right? Because I wouldn't use a nerve up here high in my neck to then talk to somewhere in my foot, right? I'm going to use a nerve lower down in the spinal level to do that. And so it's essentially, we can imagine that if the nerve goes out to that area of skin, well, it's also going to innervate muscles and organs and other things in that area as well. We already basically looked at this. What is a reflex? This is the reflex arc, right? Flexor withdrawal arc, as we normally call it, right? Of just moving your hand away from noxious stimuli, painful stimuli. So like we said, this is the bulk of the lecture to me, right? The most important parts of the lecture. The two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, what do they control? What do they regulate? You know, how are we going to use this? So our sympathetic nervous system is known as the fight or flight. So we can write that on there underneath the sympathetic that we wrote on there, fight or flight. And the parasympathetic is known as the rest and digest, or feed and breed. Now, if we can essentially learn one side, we inadvertently know the other. So remember that whole thing I talked about in the last video where we did the, you know, if you know half of the stuff, you know the other half. If you just basically know that the other category is everything you know that's not in this one kind of situation. So if we actually look at just the sympathetic division of the nervous system, we're going to learn the parasympathetic. And so, like I said, this picture really helps. I'm going to zoom in on this picture for you guys. So first and foremost, our parasympathetic division of the nervous system is known as our cranial sacral division. So you can actually see in this picture that the nerves that innervate and really conduct and move the system are coming from the spine, or excuse me, the brain itself, the cranial nerves, or the sacrum. So you might have heard of massage, you know, craniosacral massage. Well, we'll stimulate those areas to create, you know, and influence the parasympathetic response. And so actually, if you look too, even boom, that's cranial nerve 10, right? Or vagus nerve. Look what it's doing. Innervating the lungs, the heart, liver, right? All of this stuff. Crazy cool, crazy stuff. So, and then our sympathetic nervous system is known as the, you know, thoracic nervous system, the, you know, thoracolumbar division of the nervous system. So what is happening in regards to one system activating or the other? Well, let's use the example that, again, our sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight, which is essentially gearing us up for defense or running away for our lives. So let's just imagine that something really scary jumped out at you. Let's say a wild Mr. Rob. That came at you and you're like, oh no, he's crazy. So what are you going to do? Well, let's think to the microscopic moments of time. First and foremost, I jump at you and you're just walking along, having a pleasant day. Like, oh, I guess I can zoom in on my face so you can see my craziness. Like, oh, you know, it's just a great day, blah, 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 blah. You know, you're like, all of a sudden I come out, blah, 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 blah. And you're like, so let's take a look at what just happened. Well, one, your eyes widened, your pupils dilated. You took a deep breath in, right? So one, our eyes widen, our pupils dilate because we want to take as much visual stimulation in to assess the situation as possible. We took a deep breath in, and then in that regards too, respiratory rate in general is going to increase because, well, if you've ever done cardiovascular exercise, you know you breathe harder because you need more oxygen to use and move your body. Your salivation is going to go down. You get that dry mouth when you're scared, right? So those are some immediate things. Okay, let's break down into other areas, right? You locked up, you froze. We call that muscle guarding and tightening, right? Your skin tightens, your muscles tighten, right? The hairs stick up on the back of your neck kind of situation. So that's actually a defensive mechanism. Now, yeah, tightening up your muscles isn't going to stop a bullet or a knife wound, but it certainly will help if you're fighting something, bare armed or whatever, right? It's better protection than nothing. That's for sure. So muscles tighten, guard, right? Skin tightens, all that good stuff. Well, I guess not good in this case, but whatever. Let's go down into other organs, right? So like we said, respiratory rate's going to increase. Your heart rate's going to increase to, keep pumping that oxygen. Going down into the digestive system. Well, one, digestion takes an extreme amount of energy to do. Now, luckily, digestion replenishes more energy than it, takes, as long as you eat healthy, I guess. But if I'm going to die in the next couple minutes, it doesn't matter if I digest that cheeseburger, right? So I can shut off my digestive function for the time being or slow it down so that I can conserve energy to where I need it. Reproductive function is going to decrease because, again, same kind of concept. If I'm going to die in the next few seconds, I ain't going to make no babies. So then urinary and pooping functions also will decrease. Now, I know it's like, oh, when people get scared, they poop or pee themselves. Well, yeah, your body's going to either lock up your bowels or evacuate them, just get it done, right? So if we go back to our picture, you basically see just that, right? So we work our way up, right? So like we said, eyes are going to dilate, we're going to breathe harder, salivation is going to decrease, respiratory rate increases, heart rate increases, digestive function lowers. Oh, sorry, the adrenal gland function is going to increase, right? Adrenal function is going to increase. Reproductive and urinary functions decrease, right? All in regards to, like I said, the immediate moment of like fighting for your life. What do you need? Is the theory. So like I said, if you can commit to memorizing what happens in the sympathetic activation, then, well, the parasympathetic is the exact opposite. So, especially in the sympathetic division of the nervous system, our activation, all of our senses are heightened. Smell, taste, hearing, right? Because that's survival. It's survival instinct. So it's parasympathetic. Now we're good. We're safe. We're cool. We're chilling. So, pupils dilate, our gaze softens, our hearing actually lowers, right? So you ever been like so hungry you feel like you're just hearing things so sharp and crisp, and then like you eat a big meal and you just feel like the world is muffled? Literally, that's parasympathetic engagement, right? So, respiratory rate lowers, heart rate lowers, digestive function increases, you're just relaxed, you're feeling good, everything's flowing and functioning. And so, like I said, this is where we can pose the biggest benefits and advantages of massage therapy, right? Because insert all massage benefits here to the activation of the parasympathetic division of the nervous system. Digestive problems, well, relax. There we go. Increase and make it flow better, right? So it's just, I got the whole other video of the massage effects and stuff where I rant on this a lot, but like I said, make sure you really pay attention to this part of the lecture. So here's some senses. I think we all know what our senses are, but the main things on this slide are nociceptors. Nociceptors detect nociception, which is the perception of pain. Other receptors, which we're going to take a look at, is the mechanoreceptors. Photoreceptors detect visual stimulation. Smell, olfactory receptors. Taste, right? Chemoreceptors. Thermoreceptors detect temperatures. Baroreceptors detect pressure or the stretching of tissue structures in the body. So like baroreceptors and like arteries and stuff in the heart monitor, how much blood pressure is. Or baroreceptors in like the bladder, your urinary bladder measures that it's being stretched out, and it's like, oh hey, yeah, we're filling up, so you gotta pee it out here. So just the gist of receptors. But the mechanoreceptors are our bigger things that we're looking at here, which kind of go more into the muscular system, which we could have had it there, but I guess they're theoretically here. So the two main mechanoreceptors are the Golgi tendon organ and the muscle spindle fibers. These two receptors are largely responsible for monitoring the positioning of the body and specifically the muscles, their length, the tension, and all that. Now, we do have joint kinesthetics and other mechanoreceptors that help us as well, but we're going to look at these two more specifically. So the muscle spindle fiber, well, muscle spindle, right? Think a spindle is like a wound up thing. The muscle spindle fiber is like a spring, and it is attached to, as you can see in this picture, wound around the individual muscle fiber in itself. So, just like a spring, let me see if I have my slinky. I don't, but a slinky does work pretty well in this particular example, where that if I stretch out a spring, it gets tight and then snaps back, right? So the same kind of concept with the muscle spindle fiber. The Golgi tendon organ is found in the tendon, the musculotendinous section of the muscle, and it measures tension. It measures the tensile force being placed upon the muscle, or the amount of force that the muscle is exerting during its contraction. So let's talk about these a little bit more. So the muscle spindle fiber is measuring how long or lengthened the muscle is. And that when it gets to a point that the muscle is stretched out too far, well, it wants to prevent any more stretching. So what it causes is called the inverse stretch reflex, which, is the stretch reflex, which means that it's going to essentially lock the muscle up and cause it to not stretch any further to avoid tearing or injuries. The Golgi tendon organ does the exact opposite. It does the inverse stretch reflex, which is where the muscle is going to essentially shut off. And so let's say like you were just standing there and someone comes by and tries to hand you a 100-pound boulder, and you grab it and you're like, ugh, and you just immediately drop it. Well, that's because your muscles registered like, oh, that's way too heavy for us to hold. Drop that thing. You're going to hurt yourself. That's what the Golgi tendon's kind of doing. So muscle spindle fiber measures the stretch, causes the stretch reflex to lock the muscle up and stop stretching. Golgi tendon organ monitors the tensile force, or the amount of effort being exerted by the muscle. When that muscle exceeds what it can do, it's going to kind of shut itself off, so we don't, pop a tendon, basically. Our last slide here talks about neurological laws, and just basically how do they relate to massage. All right, so our first one is Arndt-Schultz law, which they did this test with like poisons, basically, but we can apply it in a generic sense of stimulation to the nervous system. So weak stimuli excites physiological activity. Moderate stimuli, favors it, and then very strong stimuli starts to retard it, while extremely strong stimuli arrests it. So what can we say here? So in this regards, we can consider our pressure. So if my pressure is so light that I'm just grazing the surface of the skin, well, it's very weak stimuli, very weak pressure, right? It excites the body, right? It tickles, right? Moderately strong stimuli, right? So if we just find a good bit of pressure, right? They're like, oh, that's the Goldilocks spot. That feels good. If I go a little bit deeper, they're like, it starts locking up. Their muscles start to relax, tighten, or not relax, but like start to lock up and react and harden up. And then if we put like super amounts of pressure, they'll just in all agony, right? And they're just going to essentially have been stopped. So we can kind of liken that to how our pressure can be effective against towards our clients. Hilton's law kind of helps us with the dermatome myotome map, that the trunk of a nerve sends its branches to a particular area, but also the skin and organs within that area. So it just means that like it just goes to the same place. Pfluger's law is actually a very interesting one. There's lots of different components to it, but this is just a summarized version of it that I have for you guys. Mild irritation on one side of the body stimulates the other side. So with that one line right there, typically, so if my client says that they have pain on like the right leg, I'm going to work the left leg first. One reason is that, I'm going to see what the unaffected side is like, and I'll see what the status quo is. Plus, working that leg neurologically will inadvertently affect the other leg. So it's technically like I work the right leg twice by starting on the left. So then when I get to the right leg, right, it's already kind of gotten some sort of stimuli by working the other side. Plus, now I can see where that right leg differs from the left leg that's not affected. If stimulation increases, stimulation is felt on that side as well as the opposite side of the body. Okay, yeah, just continue. Sherrington's law, also known as the law of reciprocal inhibition. When a muscle receives a stimulation to contract, its antagonistic muscles receive a stimulation to relax. So this is like the push-pull law, as I like to call it. So basically an example would be biceps versus triceps. Yeah, I guess I'll just knock out Newton's law first real quick before I get into that. Newton's law, so the inertian thing, object in motion stays in motion, blah, blah, blah. But the second part there, for every action or force, there's an equal and opposite reaction. I usually use that example for when I teach you guys body mechanics and your pressure, that when you're pressing on a client, if I put 20 pounds of pressure on my client, well, that's 20 pounds of pressure that's pushing back into me. So that's why you want to make sure you push. You make sure you want to keep your joints stacked. Make sure you keep everything in line and brace yourself properly, because you're putting pressure on them, but it's also coming back into you. Anyways, back to Sherrington's law, the law of reciprocal inhibition. Let's say, so biceps versus triceps. Biceps flexes the arm, triceps extends the arm. Now, if I tell my mind tells my biceps to curl something, right? Well, if it also tells my triceps to contract as well, then I'm either stuck or the stronger muscle wins out. But this works with our P&F stretching, which we'll have another video topic on. But so basically, when one muscle contracts, your body is also telling the muscles that oppose that muscle, the antagonist muscles, to relax and control that movement and allow that movement to occur. So that is the nervous system lecture. So let me go ahead and just zoom up in on that. Maybe you can kind of see, but I'll take a picture and post it up for official there. But like I said, that's basically all the structures of the central nervous system, or as well of the nervous system in general. And yeah, if you can draw and redraw that and rewrite that, especially once you get to the point where you know what the structures are, you can just do the abbreviations very similar to like I did. So that's, faster. And you can just boop, 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 boom, done, right? And then just insert the fun facts from this lecture that we went over. So, well, going to cut this one out, and we'll just Q&A it from there.